I always enjoy that moment when the audience decides that we've begun. Thanks for being here. My name's Charles Waldheim. It's my pleasure to serve as the John Irving Professor of Landscape Architecture and a co-director of the Master in Design Studies program here at the GSD. Thanks to Sarah and the team. Thanks to Matt on the ones and twos and everybody else for getting us here together. Just a note for our friends streaming online and those of you here in the audience that we do have closed captioning. If you're in person here, please use the QR code bottom left to access that live captioning, or you can check the AV booth at the back for assistance. A couple of upcoming programming notes. March 5th, that's soon. Is that tomorrow? Must be tomorrow, yeah. 6:30 p.m., the Dunlop Lecture, Kenzie Bach on the Past, Present, and Future of Public Housing. On Monday, March 9th, in this space, Marina Otero Verzier will be presenting her Wheelwright Prize lecture on feral clouds, so please join us for both of those. And then the following day, Tuesday, 12 noon, Marina Otero Verzier with Kate Crawford in conversation. For those of you that don't know, the Wheelwright Prize has been a long-standing prize awarded by the school. Originally, it was endowed to be given to one of the MArch graduates of the school, and in recent years, it's been expanded to include people from other institutions as well. And as you can tell from that roster of events, we tend to get our money's worth out of our Wheelwright Prize winners. Marina is an extraordinary architect and researcher. She's been teaching in our design studies program the past couple of years, so please turn out for those. It's also a real pleasure to be able to gather today with friends and colleagues and consider the identity of design. This is something, obviously, that we think a lot about, and we're joined this evening by somebody that's thought about it quite deeply and for a very long time. In a fairly obscure paper written about 16 years ago, Bruno Latour argued that design has had a varied history. Latour went on to argue that design has extended from the details of objects to include cities, landscapes, nations, cultures, bodies, genes, and to nature itself, which Latour argued was in great need of being redesigned. Latour argued that design has been growing in two dimensions, one in what he refers to as comprehension, and another in terms of what you might think of as extension. And by analogy, he suggested that today everyone with a smartphone knows that it would be absurd to distinguish what's been designed from what's been planned, calculated, arrayed, arranged, packaged, defined, projected, tinkered, written down, disposed of, and so on. And he goes on to suggest that design today could therefore mean almost anything. For me, in my own thinking about design, I like to think of design as promiscuous, that it moves, it changes, it transmogrifies on a regular basis, and I think that we'll hear a little bit more about that tonight. In its origins in the Latinate languages, diseño originates as a kind of invention through drawing, right? So in its origin, there is a notion, in the West at least, of the idea of capriccio and making something new, right? Making something new. And by the time it emerges in French, it's established in the 18th century as something like shaping or forming, like giving shape to, either covering or giving material form to. And as it migrates into the English language in the 18th and 19th century, it comes to mean a whole proliferation of what you might think of as kind of craft or applied arts. By the middle of the 19th century, you have schools of design in Great Britain. You also begin to see the emergence of schools of design here in North America in places like Cincinnati or Providence, Rhode Island. And in so doing, they were invoking what was then, at least, a fairly progressive idea of design. Because in those contexts, design was set opposed to or adjacent to schools of architecture, right? And schools of architecture in the academy or in the emergence of the research university, architecture was available only for certain classes of people, only certain genders of people, only certain races of people. And as a result, design became a space which was progressive by virtue of welcoming immigrants, welcoming people from different identities into a range of applied arts or crafts. crafts. The first coursework and programs in architecture that emerged in the second half in the 19th century here in North America tended to be thought about either as schools of architecture or applied arts or fine arts. I myself graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a degree in architecture from the Graduate School of Fine Arts. Right? In 1936, our university formulated what had been its separate schools of architecture and landscape architecture into a new graduate school. And in this context, they were very clearly drawing on a progressive tradition, right? This was a top-down decision by the leadership of the university. It wasn't as though the faculty here were desperate to be called into a school of design or to be joined together somehow. But in fact, the president of the university was using the economic and political crisis of the Great Depression to rally for social urgency, to take a faculty, that were otherwise distracted by their Beaux-Arts preoccupations and otherwise engaged in their own navel-gazing or engaged in their own White Tower work, to say, well, we have to think about the application of architecture and landscape architecture into the world. And in choosing the word design, the university and the inaugural dean, Joseph Hudnut, clearly identified design as valuable because it was not a professional identity. And that, in fact, design covered all the processes, this is Hudnut, 1936, all the processes by which materials are assembled and shaped in ways to afford aesthetic satisfaction. Design, therefore, includes architecture and landscape architecture and regional planning. Now, that's not something that one can say here without some danger in this space, in a context where, the school also has a long history of being a leader in those professional identities. And so with that, it's a great pleasure to welcome Zak Kyes. Zak is, as I've mentioned, among the clearest thinkers and practitioners in design these days, and has thought deeply over a couple of decades about the identity crisis within design. Seemingly now that we're all going to be replaced by generative AI, we're on the cusp of yet another crisis that we'll discuss this evening. He's been engaged in a number of creative practices, served as the art director at the Architectural Association School of Architecture. He's taught widely from his base in Europe most recently, and is, of course, the creative director and founder of the Zak Group. Please welcome Zak Kyes.
Great. Hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you, Charles, for having me and for the introduction and for establishing that context around design. And also thank you, Kenneth and Sarah, for making this all happen. I lead Zak Group, a design studio in London. We work across creative direction, brand strategy, and spatial environments, collaborating with the people, institutions, and brands shaping contemporary culture. But in many ways, I actually owe my career to architects and also to places like this. So while this talk focuses on the state of contemporary design practice, I suspect that much of it will feel familiar. Design is in crisis, and some would perhaps say architecture too. That's the painful realization that I came to while preparing for this talk. It's a crisis of identity, of what design is, and what it means to be a designer today. So that's the subject of this talk, identity crisis. This is a personal and subjective reflection on how we got here, why things feel so uncertain, and what might come next. The talk will unfold in 7 chapters. Starting with my own identity crisis and ending with a set of tools that I call crisis overrides. We'll zoom out and look at how design has historically responded to crisis and how the broader cultural, social, and technological crises have shaped its evolution. I'll also explore how systems like social media and AI have shifted from tools to engines of crisis, and explore how systems and what that really means for the future of design. I'll talk about the specific pressures facing studios today and show some examples of how we've responded. When I was preparing for this talk, I found myself returning to a feeling that many of you may share as architects. that design studios are in a crisis of becoming on-demand service providers, strategic in name, but tasked with speed, style, and substance. Our profession once aspired to universality. Designers were thought of as meaning makers, truth tellers, and cultural intermediaries. And now, too often, our work is reduced to deliverables. So to understand this crisis, I have to start with my own identity crisis. I grew up in Southern California, but my first language was Swiss German. My father was from rural America, and my mother was from Switzerland. And I moved between both places. This was life before the internet. Then came the dial-up era. In high school, I got the internet. I started my first design studio. I screen printed posters and t-shirts. And around this time, two experiences shaped my view of design entirely. First, a family friend introduced me to the work of their former neighbor, Herbert Bayer, the Bauhaus pioneer. And discovering Bayer was pivotal for me. He showed me how design could be a bridge between art and advertising, communication and the environment, and graphic design and architecture. After Herbert Bayer left Nazi Germany and moved to the US, he went on to brand the town of Aspen, Colorado, designing everything from the typography to the terrain. But the work of his that I knew best, without knowing that it was his, is this rainbow-colored sculpture on the waterfront in Santa Barbara called Chromatic Gate. And second, I got an internship at eToy, a radical Swiss art collective. At their Zurich office, I saw artists and designers working fluidly across disciplines. They operated as an art corporation. They issued share certificates. Individual members had interchangeable identities, what we'd now call anons. And this is me at 19, pictured on an eToy share certificate. eToy reframed controversy and identity as material. They, in a way, helped me understand the internet not as a medium, but as a cultural condition. Then came CalArts, which was a kind of Bauhaus in the desert. The school was in the midst of its own identity crisis. In my final year, I co-authored a book called The Institute for Words and Pictures. It was presented as a lost manuscript, recently rediscovered. It critiqued the school's transformation from a radical institution to a market-driven creative pipeline. The same day that I graduated from art school, I received a job offer from a well-known New York agency inviting me to help build the next generation of Coca-Cola. It felt like a defining moment. Choose advertising or follow the arts. But designers like Herbert Bayer and artists like eToy had shown me that these boundaries aren't fixed, and that what mattered wasn't the category, but the kind of work that you wanted to make and the values behind it. So I moved to London and followed the arts. At 21, I joined the Architectural Association as its art director. I was suddenly in a leadership role, despite being a recent graduate with plenty to figure out. The school itself began as a youthful rebellion. A group of students in the 1800s got together in kind of protest of the dominant model of architectural education. They formed an association, which was called the Architectural Association. My first major task was a heavy one, to redesign the school's identity. So, of course, I put it off. And by the time I got around to it, people told me that the AA already had a clear identity. And eventually I understood what they meant, that an identity isn't just a logo, but it's an attitude. It's the total output, the tone, and reputation of an organization. So when it came time to design the identity, we created multiple identities that reference the AA's kind of rich, multi-layered history and its past and its constantly evolving present. I stayed at the AA for 10 years. It helped me kind of find my footing as a leader and to later start Zak Group. Every architect that I met at the AA was an astute pupil of history. And in that spirit, I think it's important to revisit a recurring trope that design is always in crisis. This highly speculative timeline shows how design responded to a series of ruptures. The printing press, a crisis of control over information. It generated fear among elites, but led to mass literacy and the spread of public knowledge. Modernism, a utopian response to a crisis of meaning in a polarized and industrializing world. Counterculture, a utopian response to, a crisis really of conscience. Who should we serve? Institutions, or should we challenge them? Followed by corporate identity, where design answered, yes, we serve, a full-on embrace of enterprise and market logic. The designer as author was a crisis of authorship and agency. Designers could shape culture too. The platform era, in which design became invisible in interfaces and algorithms. And then the meme era, peak acceleration, everything is remixable, viral, and real time, and culture is flattened. Which brings us to March 2026. Welcome to the mid-tier collapse, in which mid-level design and designers are being replaced, not just by tools, but by clients who have learned how to prompt them. So if these are the crises within design history, let's zoom out, because design doesn't just suffer a crisis, it metabolizes the instability of the world around it. So I'm going to show 7 short films that visualize these global crises and show how design has responded. So this is the printing revolution. The printing press triggered the first techno-panic over the elite's control of information. It was a crisis of formats, which gave rise to new tools, typography, grids, editorial design. And what began as a disruption laid the foundation for a communications revolution that created literacy, access, and mass culture. The Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution created the division of labor and a new world of products. Design emerged to package, brand, and differentiate goods on crowded shelves. It helped to invent consumer culture, turning objects into identities while also creating the tools to critique them. Its legacy lives on today in the gig economy, atomized labor, branded identities, and endless demand. Propaganda. During World War I and World War II, design was weaponized and used to mobilize nationalism and manufacture consent. It became both a tool of war and a rebellion against it. After the devastation, thinkers like Paul Valery argued that cultural and aesthetic reinvention was the only way forward. Today, propaganda hasn't disappeared, it's just changed platforms. Counterculture. In the 1960s, graphic design became a tool of protest and identity, shaping the visual language of anti-war, civil rights, and youth movements. It amplified voices and crafted the identities of justice groups and spread messages through flyers, posters, and street graphics. It was a moment of blowing up the world that came before, while access to tools and shared knowledge became a utopian promise. AIDS. During the AIDS crisis, designers and artists confronted stigma and government silence with urgent messages. Postcards, and T-shirts became tools of protest and solidarity. Design humanized the crisis and expressed grief and defiance. The financial crisis. The 2008 financial crisis exposed how design helped build trust in a broken system. After the collapse, infographics exploded, visualizing risk, collapse, and blame. Design grappled with how to communicate the role of banks and corporations in economic collapse. Design termed minimal, flat, calm, and reassuring. Even fashion followed, functional, unbranded, and modest. A quiet response to excess and instability. The pandemic. We're still trying to figure out how design metabolized the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic certainly made design a frontline tool for public health, flattening curves, communicating social distance, spreading clarity in a storm of misinformation. But it also had to adapt to virtual collaboration, the hybrid office revolution, remote education, and screen-based everything. So in each of these global crises, design adapted and led more than it followed. But now the pressures have intensified. If gravity is the negative yet generative force shaping architecture, then technology is our equivalent in graphic design. The printing press was just the beginning. Then came the computer, the software suite, the iPhone, the algorithm, and now the prompt. So what happens when the crisis is the system that we helped build? Take the founding ethos of one wildly successful startup founded by a Harvard grad. Move fast and break things. At the time, it sounded visionary, a mantra for innovation, but it guaranteed disruption, and disruption came with consequences. Misinformation, election interference, and mass distrust. It was an ultimatum for design: prioritize speed or get replaced. Forget quality, strategy, or novelty, just deliver. Then came AI. The World Economic Forum recently released a Future of Jobs report listing graphic design as the 11th fastest declining job. It goes on to say that the presence of graphic designers just outside the top 10 fastest declining job roles may illustrate generative AI's increasing capacity to perform knowledge work. But that survey also predicts that architecture will have more projected job growth between 2025 and 2030. So perhaps architecture's slowness may be its greatest defense from AI. So it's good news for all of you. Less so for me. AI's momentum felt sudden, but there were signs. Canva in 2013, automated and AI-assisted drawing tools in the 2010s, design assistants in 2016, code-generating plugins in 2019, and by 2022, Midjourney, DALL-E, ChatGPT went viral, and creative execution became prompt-based direction. Currently, AI chatbots work best as dialogue partners, responsive, speculative, and occasionally wrong. They're trained on imperfect data. They hallucinate, producing answers that resemble conjecture. And yet, designers have always worked like this. I think we prototype, we speculate, we reframe, often without complete information. We make things up on the fly before we make them real. We create first and understand later. Those in the design industry have always known how to turn uncertainty into insight, how to use speculation to create possibility. But 4 years ago, Sam Altman reassured us that, quote, regular people would be able to do almost anything themselves, and that artists would be more productive. When anyone can create amazing art, there will be incredible upside for humanity, but downside for most individual artists. If the skill that matters will be imagination, then the human intelligence still plays a central role. It used to be that you could only pick two: fast, cheap, or good, the classic trilemma. But AI entered the marketplace just as people had grown accustomed to all three: fast, cheap, and good. DIY design with no compromises. As algorithms hijacked media consumption, social media became interest media, feeding users what they already liked. Some call this the dopamine culture. If design can't keep up with the algorithm, then AI can. And that's its own identity crisis, recycling sameness, suppressing discovery, and squeezing out curiosity and depth. Design once shaped culture. Now it follows prompts, ours or someone else's. Technology has blurred the line between making and directing. And somewhere along the lines, design stopped describing what we do and started describing everything. Design became a central metaphor in culture, setting the tone for how people understand and interact with the world. People design better lives, governments design brighter futures, marketers design experiences. Terms like icon, system, modular, scale, and so on used to belong to the designer. Now they describe everything from cryptocurrency to wellness.
People don't need stories anymore. Sometimes a vibe is enough.
It was once the role of design to shape taste. and now it curates moods. To do this, it borrows from nostalgia and aesthetic trends rather than generating its own. Briefs are received from business and tech leads who have already done the thinking. Design decisions are made by mood boards, not logic. Designers are expected to execute, not challenge. Design's identity has therefore become too broad to define and too superficial to be strategic. And worse, its relevance and value is being ceded to those who create rapidly and at scale. So influencers, brand ambassadors, and content creators. Add to this celebrities with their own design studios. What they offer isn't always expertise, it's visibility and reach. And these are just the external pressures. Internally, the demands are equally destabilizing. Studios are now expected to do everything. Increasingly, clients want speed, scale, and volume. They want solutions, not specialisms. They don't buy origination and process. They buy answers. In short, they don't really care what an agency does. Yet studios and schools remain structurally siloed, unable to meet the totality of the demand now expected. The studio is no longer a service provider. It's a provider of vibes and aesthetics. Studios used to be a space of invention. Now they risk becoming a content factory, delivering on briefs, not evolving them, maximizing deliverables, not developing concepts, providing aesthetics, not purpose. So, how can the studio be a site for creative agency, cultural purpose, and strategic thinking in an era where mediums are endless and attention is finite? At Zak Group, we've had to navigate these questions in real time, project by project and client by client. We've learned that being endlessly flexible isn't a strength, it's a liability. And the following projects reflect how we've responded to real-world pressures and internal ones too. They forced us to reconsider what a studio is for, what a studio is, and how to evolve. So let's start with one of our more unexpected collaborations, because you never know where opportunities come from. The identity of Kendall Jenner's 818 tequila. In a market flooded with lifestyle brands, the real challenge was authenticity. We didn't expect to be hired by a tequila brand, not to mention by a family of businesswomen that have shaped the image economy more than most institutions. The project raised questions that are, in a way, central to our practice. What makes a brand believable? How do you design for mass appeal without falling into cliché? When celebrities launch brands, the strategy often relies on personal image more than product. So rather than spotlighting the founder, the 818 creative team focused on the kind of old school values of quality. The result was an identity that avoided category cliches, no gold foils, no agave motifs, no overwrought storytelling. Instead, it let the product speak through form, tone, and presence. It stands apart on the shelf and, in a way, shifted celebrity branding from being personality-driven to being design-led. This project helped us to understand celebrity culture not as spectacle, but as a platform for excellent brand building. It challenged us to operate at scale without losing our identity as a studio. And it also led to our work on Sprinter, Kylie Jenner's vodka soda brand.
Sprinter's a little crazier than 818, I would say. We're a little wild.
The next project confronted a different kind of crisis, legitimacy. We were approached to develop a book about a digital art phenomena that sparked the messy and polarizing rise of NFTs. We began the project during the crypto winter, amid headlines calling NFTs a scam, a fad, and an environmental disaster. Crypto and NFTs, of course, carry baggage, hype, speculation, and volatility, to name a few. But CryptoPunks were foundational. It was one of the first and most sought-after crypto collectibles. In June 2017, Matt Hall and John Watkinson released 10,000 pixelated punks on the Ethereum blockchain that were free to claim. CryptoPunks are part artwork, part marketplace, and part community. They were the digital equivalent of baseball cards. But over time, they became a cultural phenomenon, with individual sales reaching over 23 million, and no galleries or institutions were involved. CryptoPunks became an art historical milestone, and they've since entered the collections of major museums, including the Centre Pompidou and the ICA in Miami. We felt that they deserved a permanent record. The title that we chose for the book, Free to Claim, is a nod to their original release, but also kind of a joke because they are not free, and the book was also not free. I realize publishers don't love putting the word free on a book cover. It apparently sends the wrong message. Inside the book, there was a fluorescent pink timeline that kind of contains hundreds of Discord and X posts from the punks community, not just a history, but a record of the hysteria, the backlash, and the belief. Inside the book, there's a crowdsourced glossary defining terms from the Web3 community, an interview with punk founders and Hans-Ulrich Obrist, field reports by emerging investors, curators, and artists, a visual essay by the creative director and fashion designer Martina Tiefenthaler that paired punk attributes, which sort of indicate their rareness, with accessories from her own wardrobe, shot on her iPhone. A choker, a hoodie. Artist Simon Denny contributed a blotter paper artwork of all 10,000 CryptoPunks ordered by sale price. His work kind of underscores how counterculture and technology were shaped by the same communities in California. And of course, an invitation to drop acid. When it came to the catalog section, we treated it like art history, over 400 pages laid out through an automated system documenting all 10,000 punks, indexed by number, attributes, color, and image hash. Each entry followed the conventions of fine art, medium, material, and provenance. It was also an absurd gesture, but a serious question: can something born digital ever be permanently archived? We also released a token-gated edition available only to punk holders. So with CryptoPunks, we didn't just want to document a project, we wanted to metabolize a cultural moment, one that had either been dismissed or ignored. Because we also edited the book, it became a way for the studio to collaborate with the figures shaping an emerging, if controversial, technology without being diminished or devalued by it. So if CryptoPunks dealt with a crisis of legitimacy, our ongoing collaboration with the artist Anne Imhoff confronts another, the crisis of visibility and meaning in contemporary art. Contemporary art is a field where communication is often fossilized and constrained by institutional tone. and the kind of bourgeois burden of good taste. And the artist's work demanded really a different approach. We've collaborated with Anna for the past 8 years. She's known for performances that collapse the boundaries between choreography, installation, painting, sound, and architecture. And in our experience, working with artists demands a different approach, a different mindset. It's not about branding the work. It's about translating it and finding ways to compress complex ideas without simplifying or diluting them. Our first collaboration was on Faust, Anna's exhibition at the Venice Biennial. It took place in the brutalist, fascist-era German pavilion in Venice and went on to win the Golden Lion. To counter that violence, we created something severe but elegant, drawing on Giambattista Bodoni's typographic heritage. He created a typeface called Bodoni, and we created a new custom version of that typeface. The catalog and website included WhatsApp chats between the performers and the artist used to coordinate the kind of choreography and folding in the invisible systems behind the performance. For Natur More at the Palais de Tokyo, we treated the exhibition like a campaign, not a museum show. For Emo at Spruth Magers, we started to take merch seriously. Have we reached peak merch? Maybe. I have GSD merch tonight. But perhaps also a door has opened where merchandise is finally understood and appreciated in spaces where it was once unthinkable, like an art exhibition. We approached merch not as souvenirs, but as mediums. A band t-shirt for the art kids, a signal, not just a memento. For Wish You Were Gay, an exhibition at Kunsthaus Bregenz, the title was displayed on 6 billboards that we designed throughout the city. And within days, every single billboard had been vandalized. The word gay had been cut out, literally removed from the surface. And at first, we didn't even take it seriously. But of course, it wasn't just vandalism. It was a targeted and violent attack on identity. For the artist and her team, many of whom identify as LGBTQIA+, it proved the point that visibility remains vulnerable, and that's why the gesture mattered. Most recently for Doom at the Armory in New York, the artist transformed the drill hall into a total environment, staging a performance for 60 performers. It unfolded through 2 opposing teams represented by college mascots, a cat and a wolf. It moved like a campaign through the city on posters and social platforms. There were prompts that scrolled across a jumbotron inside the hall, a shop for the merch, and costumes by Eliza Douglas. The result blurred the boundaries between campaign, exhibition, fashion, and advertising. And over time, we found that the act of translating an artist's work often crystallizes the work itself. Each project with Anna has been an opportunity to confront the systems, aesthetics, and politics that shape how contemporary art is communicated. This project begins with a crisis that's familiar to anyone working in fashion, the so-called retail apocalypse. Brick and mortar stores aren't just losing footfall, they are losing meaning. Shopping has been stripped down to efficiency and fulfillment. As Niels Olsen and Freddie Fishley wrote in their book, Retail Apocalypse, the shopping experience has been reduced to logistical necessity, and retail has become infrastructure. But some spaces resist that flattening. Dover Street Market survives because it refuses to behave like retail. It operates as a site of cultural production, closer to exhibition making than merchandising. When Dover Street Market and Nike invited us to provide the creative direction for their latest collaboration, the brief wasn't simply to launch footwear, but to translate the spirit of the product into a campaign and a global spatial installation. Our response was simple. If retail has become logistical and stripped of meaning, then let's add meaning and stagecraft. So we approached it in a way like a stage. The question became, how can we compress the energy of a stadium-sized live show into a few cubic meters of retail space? So we designed a vitrine, not as a display case, but as a kind of compression chamber that could contain light, sound, and performance without a performer. The installation functioned as an automated system, programmed light and airflow activated at scheduled intervals, creating a series of small events inside the vitrine. And over a 24-hour cycle, the vitrine followed a script with bursts of air and pulses of light to create a rhythm. From the outside, it appeared ambient, but these short and long flashes of light spelled out fragments of text in Morse code. At noon, it transmitted Nike's original creative brief. At 2 a.m., it delivered a monologue on Jungian dream analysis. And at midnight, after the shop had closed, the lights turned red and it entered a rave mode that was a kind of secret performance with no audience, or rather a private performance for the security guards and the kind of passerbys at night. Dover Street Market has always treated retail as experimentation, and this project pushed us to extend our own model, not just structurally, but conceptually, from designing objects to producing environments. In a post-retail landscape where distribution is ubiquitous, what matters is context. Design's role isn't to move product, but to add meaning. This next project began with a crisis at the heart of the creative industry, the myth of originality. Technology has steadily stripped away the mystery that once surrounded design, exposing the behind-the-scenes processes and challenging the notion of artistic genius. Access to tools has never been easier, but access to understanding remains gated. Conceived with Virgil and Nike, icons set out to challenge that. To treat cultural knowledge as something to be shared, not hoarded. To open source the process. Virgil's work, to me, was really rooted in DIY, in the original sense of the term, that you can do it yourself without experts if you know how. He wanted to open the black box and share knowledge. So we worked with him to make a book that wasn't a sealed product, but an open system that was iterative, collaborative, and educational. The starting point for the book was the 10, a series of reworked Nike silhouettes that look like in-process samples that usually sort of a privileged few would see. It gave shape to a cultural history of sneakers. Starting with the cover, we used the original 1971 swoosh by the designer Carolyn Davidson, not the one currently in use. It was, in a way, design history reframed for a new generation, and also framed too by Virgil's commentary, Something's Off. The book included original WhatsApp messages between Virgil and the Nike design team. I think WhatsApp is perhaps the main design tool of our time, and so we asked everyone to scrape their group chats for insights. We worked closely with Virgil to select never-seen-before prototypes and commissioned a lexicon to define the ecosystem around the work, the key people, places, objects, materials, and ideas. Entries like Illinois Institute of Technology, Marcel Duchamp, ready-made, and open source, which all expanded the kind of cultural context of sneaker design. The book ends with a timeline of every sneaker released up until the pub date. And Icons has since become, in its own right, an icon. And now with Virgil no longer with us, it also holds something else, a key part of his identity and ours, a shared belief in collaboration as a form of education. So I would like to close with a set of tools that we call crisis overrides. They're drawn from the past few years at Zak Group. They're lessons that have helped us to navigate moments of uncertainty, transition, and redefinition. They're not rigid rules, but kind of adaptable strategies. They've worked for us, and maybe they'll be of use to you as well. So here are 10 of these crisis overrides. The first, multidisciplinary, is mandatory. The problems that we face are complex, and one discipline is not enough. Collaboration is no longer optional. Second, uncertainty drives discovery. We think of doubt as a weakness, but doubt often sharpens thinking. Third, history is the genius. Forget the hero, forget the myth, go directly to the source. Fourth, vibes are deceptive. Vibes are signals, not substance. Fifth, rights matter. Authorship, licensing, moral rights, these aren't technicalities, they are foundational. Sixth, prototype from the periphery. Innovation doesn't come from the center, it comes from the edges. Seventh, highs guarantee lows. Creative work moves in cycles. One should expect volatility and design for what lasts. Eighth, illegibility has value. Categorization makes things efficient but also forgettable, and ambiguity is not a failure. Attention requires effort. Ninth, compress before you expand. Before you generate variations or iterations, write the sentence. Iteration amplifies whatever is already there, clarity or confusion. And 10th, there is no attention without tension. If no one resists it, it probably doesn't matter. Good ideas create opposition. So where does that leave us? Crisis is not a problem to be solved, but a working condition to be understood. Crisis isn't the exception, it's the norm. And the most vital design has always emerged through chaos and not in spite of it. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that. The first thing to say is that Zak and his team have signed so many NDAs, so many non-disclosure agreements. We're just fortunate to have you here, first of all. And so there may be some things that we're not going to be able to dive into. But the first question for me, you've referred to your group. What can you tell us about the group that's not just you?
Right. Well, the studio has kind of taken many different kind of forms over time. I started really working with publications as a kind of a medium. It was at the Architectural Association that I met architects that had used publications as a kind of architectural kind of medium or architectural site. And so I became very interested in ways that design could function as a kind of translating tool. So that kind of started out largely using the medium of publications, but the collaborators that we worked with grew over time, and that also kind of changed who composed the group. So now we have strategists, typographers, graphic designers, and kind of project managers, art directors. So the team is very kind of mixed, and we're always interested in kind of exploring new kind of formats and challenges.
And given what you've said about skilling and de-skilling, what kinds of backgrounds are you drawing the team from? Like what kinds, like you came from Cal Arts and had a certain formation, like what kinds of backgrounds do your team bring?
I mean, we have people from creative writing, from curatorial studies, from type design, from graphic design. So it's quite varied. We work with fashion designers. There's quite a kind of broad set of backgrounds.
And you're all in London?
All in London, and then a few people remote. Yeah.
Interesting question. When I talk to creative folks these days about, so many people have had different experiences after the pandemic. Some have closed their brick and mortar entirely. They've gotten out of the lease, and they're distributed virtually around the world. Others have gone back into real space. One of the concepts that's been important to you in your practice is this notion of creative direction. Right. Something about kind of vector, right? So irrespective of disciplinary identity, even irrespective of the project or the client side, how do you define or think about creative direction in your work?
Yeah, I think creative direction is one of those terms that can kind of mean everything and nothing. But creative direction for me is kind of creative management. It is the discipline of translating one idea across different channels. The history, of course, is from advertising. We've all seen Mad Men, and the figure of the creative director was coordinating brand strategy, art direction, and copywriting. So, but now, of course, the kind of role has really expanded as media has fragmented. Brands now have many different platforms, and I think the role of the designer has kind of lost power and agency and control within that ecosystem. And so I guess in a way, the creative director is a kind of structural response to the fragmentation of media. I think if it's done well, the role can kind of add meaning and coherence across this kind of ecology of media.
It's not just a circular slide tray, it's a carousel. So you've referenced several times this question of de-skilling, and implied in your first kind of diagram of multiple crises over time, the notion that, this will replace that, right? That everything that is solid will melt into air. I mean, I know in architectural circles, right, there's been anxiety about this, at least since the 1970s with the advent of computation. Beginning in the 1980s, the de-skilling, I got into graduate school because I could cut a chipboard model, but at the end of graduate school, that was all automated, right? And there's been a longstanding anxiety in our field about the loss of those skills, in part in which the academy, the gatekeepers, the old farts will say, well, but without that, that's our value system. Mm-hmm. And you seem to be arguing for a kind of fluidity of moving values across those skills. So one can move, beyond skills, but there must also be, enormous downsides to the destructive process of reskilling, retooling, generation upon generation.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of talk and also anxiety around the idea and the reality of de-skilling. I referred to it as the kind of mid-tier collapse. And in the mid-tier collapse, I think the kind of executional layer of design is no longer a kind of rare quantity. AI can iterate kind of faster than a human. And of course, in terms of education, which is kind of what you're referring to, I think, that poses like a sort of profound challenge. Like, usually you learn and design by working with someone that knows more than you. And if that kind of mid-tier is being eliminated, or that it's harder to access, then of course that poses a kind of question for how one learns. But it also, of course, creates another value, I think, which is coherence, being able to, if you can produce, all of these options and you can iterate kind of endlessly, then it creates an opportunity for, I think, designers to provide kind of coherence and meaning, and to, in a way, regain sort of agency within this system.
I mean, among the things that you've shared with us this evening that characterize your work is, what I've referred to as a kind of promiscuity. You might think of it as a kind of nimbleness across media, right? So you're working with celebrity-branded tequila through, kind of fashion installations, through advertising, a range of different, let's call them cultural forms. How do you go about deciding which collaborations to take on, and which, conversations do you say politely no to?
I mean, that's like a learning curve.
We've got some time.
Yeah. I think that, over time, you get better at, well, first of all, usually when you're approached with an opportunity, there is some kind of brief. So sort of like being able to be really dumb and ask a very simple question like, does the brief make sense? Is it like asking the right question? I mean, those are, because if it's asking the wrong question and you have to work for months to answer the wrong question, then in the end it won't really be a success. So I guess really understanding if there's a kind of sort of alignment. And if you also can kind of like if the sort of chemistry also works in a way.
And you find it productive to ask those questions of the brief sooner rather than later?
Yeah. And sometimes you lose opportunities when you do that, but maybe that's also for the best. I
mean, another thing that comes to mind as you're sharing with us the work that you've been doing is your kind of prodigious beginning of your career, right? So careers take different forms and different shapes, but you were, you acknowledged right up front, listen, I started very young with a prominent position in leadership, and you moved to form your own agency relatively young as well. So as you think about that pace of change, what recommendations do you have for people thinking about their careers? Your pathway suggests that you should, take a big swing and take a big job early on and move quickly. Is that a model that you recommend for others?
Well, I mean, there are pros and cons of both paths, but I think what I've found really important over time is to kind of develop a set of kind of collaborators, which like might be your studio mates, and really to develop to form and really value these relationships. Art school is usually like very competitive and sometimes adversarial, but the kind of connections that you make at that formative point, might kind of determine the shape of your career. So I would say that, and then the same is true with early collaborations. They can really take you in a direction that you didn't expect. So I guess my advice would be really to have a kind of collaborative approach and to kind of expose yourself to as much as possible.
I mean, one of the conversations that we're often engaged in is where in the design process or where in the role of the designer is the real value, right? You referenced it earlier in a kind of description of phases of a project. In architecture, of course, we know that certain aspects of the work is more profitable or viably profitable, where others are kind of lost leaders. So in your practice, are you conscious of, what could you say about where the work you're doing is, let's put it this way, monetized? That is it generally like being associated with the Zak Group is cool enough that you just write the retainer and you're on for the whole ride? Or do you break down where you think the value add is in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think the it also depends on like the size of your team, and we are a relatively small team. So for us, like projects that have, I guess the projects that are kind of intellectually the most rewarding and also financially viable are the ones where we can develop an idea that can be sort of executed across, sometimes with the support of other teams. So I guess it would be really at the start to develop essentially, I guess, what you would call concept design and architecture. So that is also, I think, one of the most exciting parts of a project.
Just looking at Chad. What do you miss about being an art director in a school of architecture? There must be something.
Well, it's not the architects that think that they're designers, graphic designers. I think it would be. I mean, Chad and I were speaking the other night, and what I found really incredible about being kind of in-house within an architecture school was that there was, in a way, no client. I think other people would sort of beg to differ, but you could really sort of get away with a lot, and could also the boundaries were very porous, I think, and it was interesting for me to kind of push the kind of integration of graphic design into the academic and intellectual life of the school, which I see here as well. So that is something that I really enjoyed and miss.
Thanks for that. I mean, I don't know. I don't think it's so common in schools of architecture or design, for that matter, to have in-house art direction. First of all, on the one hand, it has to do with resources. On the other hand, even with resources, the general tendency has been to hire a big brand name and then send them on their way. So sitting within the institution, it's interesting to think about, the idea of having no client. At the same time, it strikes me that in the conversations that I've been at, if I were in that situation, you've got a lot of constituents, at least. There's a lot of people. It's one of the joys of being in a place like this or a place like the Architectural Association. What I'd like to do, if you'll allow us, is to put a couple of questions just in the cloud. So what we'll do is I've got one more for you, but then I know if you have comments or questions, we'll take a few of them and we'll get a kind of a cloud of them going, and then we can decide which of them your legal team will let you respond to. Does that sound okay?
Good.
All right, cool. So the last question for me, there are microphones on the side. If you just raise your hand, people will come find you. So I know that you've thought a lot about, in a deep way, the relationships between, design or graphic design or other forms of design and architecture, right? And at the same moment, of course, my introductory remarks and my own thinking about it, increasingly I'm interested in the fault lines. Like when and where does architecture stop being the thing, right? And it happens only very rarely, it seems, that a new profession is spun off or a new subdiscipline. So what I'd like to ask is, Zak, are there aspects of being not architecture, the separation of design from architecture, that are productive or thoughtful for you?
Well, I mean, I guess I would be rather interested in the kind of the opposite, the kind of inverting the question, which would be the sort of connection between, let's say, brand and architecture. If you think of, I think both in a way try to answer, with respect to brands, the same question of how you can express an idea at scale. So the scale could be like a poster or a building. brands, whether they are, let's say, like MoMA or Prada, exist in this constellation of images, campaigns, buildings, spaces, events, and the question is then, how can architecture kind of express the meaning of a brand or a cultural institution, for example? And I don't think it's a kind of matter of like applying a logo to a building, though I was reminded that we did that with Art Lab earlier.
Zak and the Zak Group did the neon, identity of the Art Lab over in Alston in the Barco Leibinger building. So.
Yeah. But rather, how can architecture sort of express with design and brand identity a kind of coherent message?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, what I hear you saying is that these institutions are first and foremost mediated. We encounter them that way, right? I mean, I encountered the GSD as a brand through media before I ever, stepped foot into Gund Hall. Down here.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. So obviously you place a lot of importance in your collaborations, and it's amazing to see these larger brands and things that maybe I'm more aware of that you've collaborated with. I'm curious also about your collaborations on a smaller scale, like even on the individual level, and what gets you excited about those. Yeah. Thank you.
So let's get a couple going. So up here. Yeah, in the center. Thanks.
Thank you for the talk. I was quite struck by the Bregenz posters you showed and the way that they sort of gained strength with the surgical removal of the word gay. And I just would be curious to hear your thoughts on whether that made you reflect on, I guess, this question of absence, and whether there was any kind of response from the posters being replaced or from the artist, or yeah, something in response to that kind of surgical removal. Yeah, thank you.
Let's do one more. Top right up here. Yeah.
Hi. I usually don't speak up when there are more than 10 people, but it's my first time asking questions.
We're glad that you're here.
Thank you. So my question is, I'm a first-year urban design student, and then whenever people ask me what are you going to do in the future, then I don't really see myself in the architecture industry. And I always say I seek for a timing to escape architecture industry. And when I saw your projects about the contemporary design practice, I felt like that's what I'm kind of interested in. So if you have any advice for people in design industry, like what, do you have any advice for people in a design industry? Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to hold all these questions.
So we've got collaborations that are more personal.
Yeah.
That
okay.
is, do you do, the question is, do you do pro bono work for friends, I think?
Yeah, exactly.
Up here is like, what about the surgical removal of that word? Does that actually make the campaign even more legible in its absence? And then the queue for job applications will open up here in about 10 minutes.
I mean, in terms of individual collaborations, or there are a lot of most all of these collaborations really start with a kind of individual dialogue with one person that is able to make decisions, and I think that's also answers your question about how you go forward with a project or decide to work together. And we've worked quite extensively with a curator, Susanne Pfeffer, who actually curated Anna Imhoff's exhibition in Venice at the Venice Biennial. We've worked with her across the different institutions that she's directed, and everything from a coffee cup to of the institution to the design of the foyer to publications. And I I enjoy that because I see it less about like a series of like discrete objects and rather kind of like giving shape to a kind of whole world or institution. So yeah, there have been individual collaborations that have been really kind of influential and inspiring. We've been, with Susanna, we've been working on a like 600-page book of Marcel Duchamp, which is like 2 years late, but should be coming out very soon. Yeah, this is something that I'm particularly excited about.
That's not going to be free either. That's going to be a pricey item, I'm guessing.
The posters, what happened to those posters? It happened actually like 4 or 5 different times. It was also Oktoberfest, so it became like increasingly dumb in terms of the vandalism. But it revealed something, I think, really startling, of course, that it was very violent, but that also a kind of poster or banner and design, by extension, like still has a real power. They were replaced each time. It was also covered in the media, and so I think it, actually started like a very important conversation and gave more visibility to the topic that was adjacent to the artist's exhibition.
Following up on the question of collaborations, how deep into a conversation do you get before you get to know who the principal is behind it? That is, when people reach out to you, I'm guessing they have people that have people to open these conversations. And how quickly do you get to know who the principal is?
Sometimes a lot of individuals have different types of handlers and management and agents, and it's for sort of, and also other creative directors. So it is, you sometimes the most important people in those configurations aren't the principals, but are the sort of creative team that create the kind of world of that individual. Other times it's really like, the individual is deciding everything. But yeah, usually, it's very rarely the first conversations, it's happened, but usually it takes some time.
Please. Yeah.
Zak, thanks for your wonderful talk. I wanted to just ask a question about that, kind of following up on the question of collaborations. That has been just like such a central part of your practice over the course of your career. And we heard a lot about Anna, but of course you've got a long record of really important collaborations with a number of artists and curators and institutions across contemporary art. And, you started your career out in this more like kind of experimental realm, and now you've got a thriving practice that has many people employed, and one might guess that the more commercial projects kind of help pay the bills and keep the office going, but yet you keep coming back to these kinds of collaborations with individual artists, with doing exhibition design, things that may fall on the other end of that spectrum that aren't so commercial. And I'm wondering if you could just say a little more about like the not the financial, but just the value of that to you as a designer, to you as a practice, and so on.
Yeah, I think that holding the tension between being able to do something that is like incredibly commercial and like extreme, like a loss leader, and extremely uncommercial, is like the interesting place to be, and so that's something that we kind of consciously try to encourage. The commercial projects are like a test of being able to work at a certain scale and to translate like the same thinking that you can apply to like an individual collaboration with an artist to, you know, a very sort of like a global reach. So I think that has been like one of the kind of motivating factors. I think if I think of the, let's say like the artwork that I like most, it's you know, it's hard to categorize, and I think that gives a kind of value to it. And so I guess I think of a studio in the same way, that the sort of more difficult it is to like neatly categorize, kind of the more interesting it is.
Please join us in this space tomorrow evening for the Dunlop Lecture on the state of public housing in this country, on Monday evening with Marina Otero-Versier to discuss her work on the Wheelwright Prize. Please join me in welcoming Zak Kyes.